It is 8 o'clock. This is the UK Tonight. Coming up, Keir Starmer tells Donald Trump the US must be the deterrent to any further Russian aggression in Ukraine. The Prime Minister met European leaders in Paris this afternoon, saying the continent has to step up and be responsible for its own defence, with President Trump's support appearing to waver as he pushes for a deal with Vladimir Putin. Tonight, I'll be asking what a peacekeeping force would look like, whether the UK can play a major role, and if the country still has a seat at the top table on the big global issues. Also ahead, the woman killed in a Valentine's Day shooting at a pub in Kent is named. Lisa Smith was shot dead outside the Three Horseshoes in Knockholt on Friday. The suspect was known to her, and a car belonging to them was found a few hours later on a bridge over the River Thames. We'll have the latest. Plus, as a British couple who are motorcycling through Iran have been detained, I'll be speaking to the daughter of a British-Iranian man who spent nearly 5 years in prison in the country. And an incredible sight off the coast of Cornwall as a humpback whale puts on a real show near Newquay. I'll be joined by the man who captured these amazing pictures. All that to come and much more here on the UK Tonight. Good evening. In the last hour, Keir Starmer has sent a message to Donald Trump saying the US must be the deterrent to any further Russian aggression in Ukraine. The Prime Minister admitted that Europe must also step up and be responsible for its own defence after meeting his counterparts in Paris. But he insisted the US has to be what he called a backstop. America and Russia are holding talks in Saudi Arabia tomorrow, and President Trump's commitment to Europe's defence appears to be wavering as he tries to strike a deal with Vladimir Putin. The UK, the EU and, of course, Ukraine were not invited to those talks. From Paris, our Europe correspondent Adam Parsons has this.
The Prime Minister was the first guest to arrive at this meeting, warmly greeted by the French President. Leaders from two nations that have long cherished the transatlantic alliance and both now fear it fraying. More leaders followed from Europe's biggest countries, as well as from NATO and the European Union, a show of unity and of anxiety.
Europe must play its role, and I'm prepared to consider committing British forces on the ground alongside others if there is a lasting peace agreement. But there must be a US backstop, because a US security guarantee is the only way to effectively deter Russia from attacking Ukraine again.
European leaders gathered here purely because of the actions, rhetoric and criticism of Donald Trump and his top team. But while they met at the Elysee, the Americans and Russians were in Saudi Arabia, debating the future of Ukraine. The Russian delegation revelling in this sudden diplomatic turnabout, delighted that Europe has been left on the margins.
The
European philosophy hasn't gone anywhere, so I don't know what they should do at the negotiating table. If they're going to weasel out some cunning ideas about freezing the conflict while actually intending, as is their custom, nature and habit, to continue the war, then why should we invite them at all?
But could there really be a peace deal if Ukraine isn't at the table? The country's president has travelled to the Middle East, defiant.
Ukraine regards any negotiations on Ukraine without Ukraine as negotiations with no result. And we cannot acknowledge any arrangements about us that were made without us.
Many of these leaders accept they need to invest more money, time and thought into defence. And if the world order is changing, if America is becoming a less reliable ally, then that process will surely accelerate. Adam Parsons, Sky News, Paris.
Our chief political correspondent, John Craig, joins me now from Westminster. Evening to you, John. I guess this is what it looks like when President Trump and his team put the cat amongst the pigeons.
Well, you heard the very brusque words of the Russian foreign minister there, really basically saying to Europe, keep your noses out, we're going to do a deal with President Trump. There will have been some alarm inside the Elysee Palace today at the rather intransigent way that the Americans and the Russians are forging ahead with talks with not only no European representation, but no representation from Ukraine as well. Now, it is quite a big step for the British Prime Minister to say that he's considering committing British forces, he said, on the ground alongside others if there is a lasting peace agreement. Now, one would assume that the others would include the French. After all, it was President Macron who called this summit in Paris. And, of course, they have long seen their role as peacekeepers around the world, as have the British in terms of... One thinks back to Tony Blair's interventionist stance, Kosovo, Sierra Leone, and, of course, notoriously Iraq. It was interesting, I couldn't help noticing that alongside Sir Keir, as he strode from the Elysee Palace this evening, alongside him was Jonathan Powell, who was Mr Blair's Chief of Staff in the Blair years in Downing Street, now the National Security Advisor to Sir Keir Starmer. And of course, Mr Powell is also a former Deputy Ambassador in Washington. Mr Starmer's next move is a tricky encounter with President Trump in Washington, which we now have had confirmed will happen next week. He's got to convince the President that Europe shouldn't be left out of all this, and that it's the right thing to do for British and French and perhaps other peacekeeping troops to be there in Ukraine. Then, of course, there are the calls back here for a Commons vote on any military intervention by the UK. Already the Liberal Democrats have called for it. Some Labour left-wingers as well, like Diane Abbott and Clive Lewis, have talked about their unease at what the UK is going to do and British troops being put in harm's way. Sir Keir has said that he's not doing it lightly, putting troops in harm's way. But we are entering a very difficult phase for the Prime Minister as he attempts to win over, to some extent, President Trump, that he's doing the right thing. And, of course, there'll be a big debate here in Parliament, possibly as early as next week, on the whole issue of military intervention and, of course, the big subject of defence spending and calls for much more spending on defence by the British government.
Well, John, thank you very much indeed. We're going to drill now into the UK's spending commitments on defence and the impact a peacekeeping force would or could have in Ukraine. The UK is set to spend £68.7 billion on defence in the coming year. That's compared to £214 billion on health and social care and just under £100 billion on education. Current defence spending is equivalent to 2.33% of GDP. That's above the 2% NATO minimum requirement, although many other countries don't meet that. The UK is now expected to go even further still, hitting 2.5%. Would take the total to £74.6 billion. 3% will cost another £20.7 billion a year on top, taking the bill to more than £95 billion, almost on parity with education. President Zelensky says any peacekeeping force he needed would require at least 110,000 troops, putting even greater pressure on European countries' defence spending. The UK says it will contribute, but there are only 74,000 soldiers in the entire British Army. A defence source has told Sky News the UK could probably contribute around 5,000 troops for a long-term mission. From Lviv in Ukraine, our defence and security editor Deborah Haynes reports.
The relentless brutality of Russia's war. Here, Ukrainian soldiers on the counter-attack. This is a front line that could become frozen in any ceasefire deal, with foreign forces potentially brought in to keep the peace. British troops like these could be among them. They have expertise in commanding operations, but no longer much capacity.
What is lacking are the teeth, the sinews of war, the capabilities, the people, and this requires significant numbers of people. For example, if Britain was to sign up to providing some 10,000 troops for this, that would actually mean 30,000.
The last time the UK deployed forces at any kind of scale was to Afghanistan. But keeping 10,000 soldiers on the ground requires another 10,000 to be resting back home and a third 10,000 to be preparing to deploy. Today, Britain would likely struggle to muster a force half that size to help uphold any ceasefire. While Keir Starmer is talking about the possibility of sending British troops here to Ukraine, defence insiders say he needs a reality check. The armed forces have been hollowed out over decades, and sources tell me unless the Prime Minister quickly increases defence spending to a minimum of 2.5% of GDP, which amounts to an extra £5 billion a year, he faces the prospect of new big cuts to the military. Speaking at a security summit in Munich over the weekend, the Ukrainian president signalled any foreign peacekeeping force would need to comprise at least 110,000 troops. A huge undertaking for the UK and its European allies, unless the US also plays a part.
It's a heck of a lot cheaper to prevent a war than to have to fight one. And I think what's more important than the 2.5 or 2.65 debate that I read about going on here in the UK is what kind of force do you want to have? And what you need is a military force that can operate for sufficient duration and an ample scale to prevail in a conflict.
The hope, of course, is that if an international force is sent to Ukraine, it would never have to fight. But the soldiers would need Russia to believe that they could and fight to win. Deborah Haynes, Sky News, Lviv, Western Ukraine.
Some breaking news to bring you now. And a plane has crashed at Toronto Airport in Canada, a Delta Airlines plane. And the media there are saying that up to 8 people have been injured. The pictures online show a snowy airport and the plane completely turned upside down. It doesn't look like there's any fire damage, although I have to say this is all coming from images on social media. And some images seem to show people milling around the plane. It's quite remarkable. It seems to be so far that people have been accounted for, but early days in terms of what we know this side of the Atlantic. But the latest we've heard is that at Toronto Pearson Airport, the Delta Airlines flight that had flown from Minneapolis in the United States has crashed, and up to 8 people on that flight have been injured. We'll bring you more as we get it on that plane crash at Toronto's Pearson Airport in Canada. Back to our lead story, though. Keir Starmer sending a message to Donald Trump tonight, but is he going to listen? How big a role does the UK still have in these big global issues? How likely is it that British boots will be on the ground at some point in Ukraine? To discuss this, I'm joined now by John Foreman, who's a former UK defence attaché in both Moscow and Kyiv. And we're also joined by Dr. Alan Mendoza, the founder of the Henry Jackson Society, a transatlantic foreign policy and national security think tank. It's good to see you both. Alan, first of all, if I can come to you, we could have expected this, couldn't we? In the run-up to the election in the US and since then, this is no massive surprise, is it?
No, I think the pace of it has perhaps surprised people, and the way in which Europe's been thrown to one side, as it were, or even under the bus, and indeed the way Ukraine's been thrown under the bus. I mean, I think there was a sense that there would have been a discussion, at least, between the Americans and the Ukrainians, then the Americans and the Russians, and maybe then a summit between all 3 of them with the Europeans in process. That is not seemingly happening. We've got the Americans steaming right ahead, and while you could have predicted something along those lines, I think the pace of it has really shocked Europe and indeed the UK.
Yeah, so does it mean the UK is now somehow diminished in the eyes of the US, diminished on the global stage?
Well, I wouldn't say diminished because we still have a lot to offer. But in reality, what this has shown us is that the Trump administration is intending to take a very transactional approach to all foreign and defense policy matters. It's what you can bring to the table that matters. If you can actually turn up with some force or some diplomatic out or some kind of leverage, then you're at the table. And if you can't, then you're not at the table. So the onus is on, indeed, what Keir Starmer is doing, which is trying to kind of show a bit of leg, as it were, and say, right, we've got some force, you're going to need some peacekeepers. Now we're going to use that as leverage to get round the table in some way, shape or form, because unless you want Americans to be staffing this, you're going to need us as well on the ground.
John, let's talk about the difficulties of that, because Volodymyr Zelensky reckons that Ukraine needs 110,000 troops on the ground. That's about 50% more than the entire British Army has in terms of soldiers. What can we really contribute here?
Well, I think firstly, 110,000 is complete fantasy. It's not going to happen. I don't think it needs to be that high. But I think before we get to the size of the force and the shape of the force, we've really got to be clear about the political mission of that force if it goes into Ukraine. I think that's why Mr. Starmer mentioned the lasting peace deal and the US backstop. It's obviously the concern for the meeting that came out today in Paris is that Europe on alone is unwilling to send troops into Ukraine without a US backstop. There's no point in having a tripwire force. This is when you pull the tripwire, the Americans aren't there or somebody's not there to come over the horizon to help you out. So there's various options we could sketch out, whether it's a reassurance force and doing training in Western Ukraine, whether it's an air-orientated mission, whether it's a tripwire force in Eastern Ukraine. But again, I think we've got to be very careful politically. Let's be clear what we're talking about. Are we willing to have troops on the ground, potentially in conflict with Russia? Is the British public happy to do that as well?
Well, given the context of recent expeditions abroad, right? I mean, there'll be things like the Balkans and Afghanistan and Iraq front of people's minds, and they haven't all gone massively successfully. Is that a fair assessment? That's going to upset a lot of people with the idea that this could happen even closer to home this time?
Yeah, but I think Bosnia is a slightly separate issue. But of course, the missions in Iraq and Afghanistan were counterinsurgency missions against the Taliban or against an Iraqi insurgency. They weren't against the mechanized Russian army. And the British Army, unfortunately, is the wrong shape because after 25 years, we've had a limited, smaller army to go and do expeditionary operations like Bosnia, like Iraq and Afghanistan. And suddenly we've been trying to pivot back to a sort of proper mechanized force to meet our NATO commitments, but we're not there either. So you've got a sort of a bit of a mix. We haven't got the right shape of army. We haven't got the right enablers. We've taken risk at it. And I think now our collective bluff has been called by Mr. Trump, and that's why we've been scrambling in emergency summits in Paris.
I'll come to some hypotheticals in a second, but first, Alan, I'm going to come back to you. Do you think the UK, maybe other countries too, have been complacent with the peace dividend in recent decades?
Oh, absolutely. I think, everyone's recognised that for the past few years even. I think from the first Trump administration, when the issue was really quite aggressively and rightly raised by the Americans to say, you've been coasting, on our tails for a long time. You should have been putting more money into defence over this period. You've allowed your own capabilities to be diminished. We've stupidly allowed you to do that as well. And that's stopping. And I think in the first Trump administration, you saw the reaction of Europe and the UK, which was, right, we are going to try and increase our money. But I don't think anyone realised that come Trump 2, there'd be an immediate return to that, which in a sense should have been obvious. And we are now at the stage when the chickens have come home to roost. And the problems you've just heard in terms of our forced disposition have been there for some time, and we've got to do better. And this is the wake-up call.
Britain may well say, well, hang on, we spend 2.33% of GDP on defence. It's probably going to rise to 2.5% fairly soon. We hear stories over the weekend of Keir Starmer wanting to go even further and may, pull the strings on that, overriding what the Chancellor might want to do in the budget. What about all those other countries, Alan, that are not stepping up and spending 2% at least? You've got Portugal, Canada, Italy, Spain. None of them spend enough.
Absolutely correct. And I think the reality is that we're not spending enough for a very complicated world with multiple threats in multiple different theatres. And those countries are certainly not spending enough. And actually, what we need to be doing now is actually banging their door and doing, in a sense, what the US is doing to us and saying, right, we're stepping up a bit more. You need to step up a lot more, because otherwise this is just not going to work. You are not going to coast on our coattails here while we spend the money and you don't.
John, back to you. You've been a defence attaché in both Moscow and Kyiv. Well, let's ask you what they'll be thinking in those capitals right now. Let's start with Kyiv. What will they think in terms of what Britain might be able to step up and do? Because vocally, at least, and certainly with arms, we've been supportive thus far of Ukraine. But what will they be hoping from us from this point onwards?
Well, I think the Ukrainians are desperate to get us on the ground. This whole talk about 110,000, the whole talk of, I'm sure it's again a fantasy about European army being formed to defend Europe. I mean, it's not just the Ukrainians. I think all the countries in Eastern Europe are desperate to keep US engagement. And you really see talks in the Financial Times about risk being taken, perhaps, by Americans pulling out of the Baltic states of Poland. That's going to cause a lot of alarm bells. So it's in their interest to encourage us to be in there for the long term. Personally, I'm not convinced the UK should be having a long-term land commitment to Ukraine. But, I can see the political rationale for that from Starmer. And I think on the Russian side, I think they're absolutely delighted so far how things gone. They've achieved their first step, which is negotiations. I think they can grind out a good deal for themselves. I think they're not particularly bothered about the British, and I think they will try and veto a European force by saying, hey, you've been party to this conflict, you've been providing weapons to Ukraine, now you want to be the peacekeepers. So again, I think the issue of security guarantees is absolutely fundamental, and I think the whole thing may fall down because Britain won't submit troops without a US backstop, and the Russians may not allow the Europeans to be there, so you might end up with a sort of mixy-blob, which is a naval term, of various other troops, or you just have to arm Ukraine to the teeth and provide support remotely.
Well, you've slightly got ahead of my hypothetical question. With the war 3 years old now, would it have been wiser, maybe cheaper, maybe more secure if Britain had got involved a bit sooner in a proper way and allowed planes and allowed longer-range missiles earlier on? I know we could all look back and say woulda, coulda, shoulda, but John, what do you think? And I'll come to you, Alan, to finish off.
I asked that question before the war started. So when we got indication that the invasion was going to happen about October, November 2021, we had options being thrown around. And I said, one of the options on the table was to send the 82nd Airborne, the 101st Airborne, or the 16th Air Assault Brigade, or the 3 Commander Brigade to eastern Ukraine to provide a tripwire force. And that wasn't politically acceptable at the time.
Yeah.
And the Americans weren't going to do the same either. That's what drove us down the route of providing arms remotely. But then we had the not providing quite enough arms in time because the Biden administration wanted to manage the situation rather than to confront the Russians head on, which has always been their concern. They don't want a direct clash with Russia. But we are where we are. I would hope that a peace with honour can be struck, and that whatever the UK does helps Ukraine maintain its sovereignty and its independence.
Alan, quick word from you on the hypotheticals of the past 3 years and what could have been done better. I mean, there'll be lots of things, but you've got a minute.
No, look, you're totally right. It could have been done better at the start. We could have gone far more in with supporting Ukraine. We saw down the line that the Russians were paper tigers when it came to the threats on that respect. We should have realised that much earlier when they were in trouble. We didn't take those chances, though. We are where we are. And I think the single most important thing right now is that a peace emerges that Ukraine can at least look everyone in the eye and go, well, we gave it our best shot and we weren't let down at that negotiating table. And I think we've still got a surprise. I don't think that just because Donald Trump is negotiating and his people are negotiating, it's a foregone conclusion that Russia gets what it wants. I think he needs to get to the table, and now we'll see what he can negotiate through at that table.
Dr. Alan Mendoza and John Foreman, appreciate your contribution this evening. Thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.
Still to come, here on the UK Tonight, the woman shot dead at a pub in Kent on Valentine's Day is named as 43-year-old Lisa Smith as CCTV emerges of the attack. And the family of a British couple detained in Iran say they're focused on securing their safe return.
I'm Stephen Murphy, and I'm Sky's Ireland correspondent based here in Dublin. All alcohol products, not just wine, will have labels warning of liver disease and the link to fatal cancers.
Is it crazy?
It's an industry worth around €14 billion a year. That's why Italy sees this Irish plan as such a threat. It's always instructive and occasionally entertaining to hear what Donald Trump has to say on the issue of Brexit.
She's got her own way of doing it, that's okay.
The job takes me to every corner of this island. The rioting stemmed from a horrific daytime stabbing attack at a primary school in the city centre. The scale of the rioting and the destruction it caused is pretty much unprecedented here in Dublin. Jerry, any comment on the judge's decisions? Do you feel vindicated, Jerry? This is the end, the somewhat chaotic end, of a 52-day trial. Micheál Martin could be set to head back to government with the Taoiseach Simon Harris. Are you confident that you can now return as Taoiseach?
I'm cautiously optimistic and excited.
A mystery press conference hastily called. Leo Varadkar strode out and didn't disappoint.
I am resigning as President and Leader of Fine Gael effective today.
The people here sometimes feel they're somewhat neglected by the Irish government, to the extent that this place is sometimes known as the Forgotten County. The waters of Ireland and Britain should be home to great white sharks, but none have ever been found. If there are great white sharks in this area, there's no reason they wouldn't come here to feed. It's basically a buffet on a beach. This could be not only a record-breaking storm, but potentially the most dangerous storm ever to hit Ireland. Sky News. Get the full story first.
Weeknights on Sky News.
This is your chance. Tell people.
Welcome to the Politics Hub.
Our police force has apologised. If you want to find out about Grimsby, you come to the docks.
I'm live in Jerusalem.
Are you not concerned that that could lead to all-out war?
Hello there, good evening. There are fears of an upsurge in violence. What's at stake here?
You are watching the press preview, a first look at the front pages as they arrive.
We're going to bring you more now on that plane crash that's just happened in Canada at Pearson Airport in Toronto. And we're just getting these pictures which give you a sense of what's happened. It's a Bombardier CRJ-900 flight, which holds up to 70 people, and it flipped on its back. Remarkably, the latest we're hearing is that one person has been critically injured, 8 others are injured. We don't know how many people are on board at present, but it's a plane that can hold more than 70 people. It was flying to snowy Toronto, as you can see there from these live shots of the airport from Minneapolis, not too far away across the border in the north of the United States. As you can see, emergency crews are on the scene right now. The latest we're hearing is that one person is critically injured, 8 others are injured too, and the plane is effectively completely upside down on its back. We saw pictures online earlier on of the doors of the plane open and people seeming to be milling around on what you think was the runway. Let's bring in Sky's James Matthews, who's in Washington for us this evening. And James, it's terrible to be talking about yet another plane crash in North America.
Yeah, Matt, all too frequent. And clearly that is an alarming image. We're looking at the emergency services tackling the incident. The fire brigade, they were spraying their hoses on that upturned fuselage, concentrating on the rear of the plane. There appeared to be some smoke coming from the underside, now on the top side of the aircraft. One of its wings appears to have been sheared off as it flipped onto, as it flipped upside down. The landing gear, the wheels, they certainly were extended at the front. Difficult to see at the back where there's clearly more damage. But that is one lucky escape, as you say. Paramedics are saying that there are 8 injuries. One of those is critical. The rest have suffered mild to moderate injuries. The pictures that we've seen, they show, yes, emergency services. They also show what appear to be passengers standing by the aircraft that they have just left. The door of the aircraft was opened, and they've clearly been able to make some kind of orderly exit, those who were not casualties in all of this. As to the cause of it, clearly it's too early to say, but as you point out, there are snowy conditions at Toronto Pearson International. A very busy airport, handles more than 40 million passengers a year. This aircraft, this Delta Airlines aircraft, was flying in, having made its journey from Minneapolis, St. Paul to the Canadian city, and it's clearly a lucky escape. The plane appears to have flipped upside down, but in terms of subsequent damage and subsequent danger of ignition and so on, and all the attendant dangers that come with an aircraft flipping upside down, it clearly could have been much worse. Emergency services on the scene very quickly, and will have had much to do with the low casualty count, as we say, 8 injuries, 1 critical.
Yes, James, and that in itself seems remarkable, given the pictures we are looking at right now. The other thing that leaps out, certainly if you're sat on this side of the Atlantic, is the airport is really snowy. You'd imagine that plane flying from Minneapolis to Toronto would have gone over the Great Lakes region, which at this time of the year is quite often covered in ice and snow. But Toronto Airport, in fact, all those airports in that area that are affected by this kind of continental wintry weather, they'll be well used to dealing with it, won't they?
Yeah, there are few countries in the world more attuned to snow, dealing with snow and the dangers of these kind of snowy conditions than Canada. So clearly that will feed into the investigations as to a cause. It may be of relevance that where we see that plane upside down, it is a snowy section of the tarmac, of the apron at the airport. The question will be how it got there, why it got there. It clearly would have been landing on a runway, which presumably would have been cleared of snow and fit for landing and takeoff. And what was the onward journey that took it from runway to what is a snowy corner of the airport? Clearly there was been some kind of after something went wrong, some kind of impact. It clearly took it on beyond the runway to its final resting place. And you're watching the fuselage being dampened down. As I say, there appeared, Matt, to be some smoke coming from the rear of the aircraft, the bottom rear of the aircraft, or top, albeit, following its tilting upside down. That will be very much a precautionary measure to make sure that there is no danger of ignition. Clearly, if there has been metal on gravel skidding across the apron at Toronto Pearson, that creates a danger of fire, of ignition, and that's something they will be taking care of right now. And it highlights the danger, I suppose, that was faced by the people on board for whom this must have been a horrendous experience to end up inside a plane on the tarmac, upside down, probably skidding across the runway. Clearly, this has been a miraculous escape. As you say, it can hold dozens of passengers, that aircraft, but 8 injuries, 1 critical, and the rest of the casualties, we are told, suffered mild to moderate injuries. Very early days. The police on the ground, they are saying very little. One was asked about the circumstances, and a police spokesman answered, there is a plane crash. However, we don't know the circumstances surrounding it at this point. That was Constable Sarah Patton of the Peel Regional Police in Ontario. She went on, it's my understanding that most of the passengers are out and unharmed, but we're still trying to make sure, so we're still on scene investigating. And that will be a priority, won't it? Although most, if not all, of the passengers appear to have got out, and indeed the authorities are saying all passengers are accounted for. There will be an ongoing operation to make sure they're okay, and also an examination taking place inside, as far as is possible, inside the aircraft to as part of the early investigation, if nothing else. But the scene we saw earlier and pictures we have seen, they show members of the public, clearly, presumably passengers, yet to be confirmed, but they're quite close, standing on the tarmac, quite close to the plane, some taking pictures and so on, having made, as I say, what has to be a miraculous escape.
Certainly seems that way for the time being, although you're right, James, it is early days. I'm sure we'll get updates from you in Washington, D.C. throughout the evening as we learn more about this plane crash that's happened on the tarmac at Toronto Pearson Airport in Canada on a flight, a Delta Airlines flight from Minneapolis to Toronto there. Back here to the UK, and police have now named the woman who was shot dead outside a pub in Kent on Valentine's Day as 43-year-old Lisa Smith. Officers believe the man suspected of carrying out the attack on Friday may have gone into the River Thames after his car was discovered on the Dartford crossing. CCTV has also emerged of the moment of the attack, where several gunshots can be heard. Sky's Rachel Venables joins me now in the studio. Rachel, tell us more about what we found out today.
Well, the most important piece of information, of course, we found out today is the identity of the woman who was killed on Friday night, on Valentine's Day, outside this pub, the Three Horseshoes in Knockholt, very near Sevenoaks in Kent. And she's been named by the police as Lisa Smith, 43 years old, and she was from Slough. Now, we don't know much more about her. We do have a photo there. You can see her. That is 43-year-old Lisa Smith, who was obviously at the Three Horseshoes pub in Knockholt in Kent on Friday evening, and you can see there the pictures of the aftermath, a huge police presence after they were called out to the scene to reports of gunshots. 3 we just heard, of course, played out in that CCTV footage, which was obtained by Sky News. Quite a long pause almost between the first and second, and after that CCTV footage goes on, you can hear shouts of people in obvious scenes of real terror and distress as they realised what had happened, and Lisa, very sadly, was pronounced dead at the scene soon afterwards of her injuries. So that's something that the police have told us today. We also know that the manhunt continues for their suspect. We know that they believe the suspect knew the victim, knew Lisa, and police also telling us they think he fled in a car that was actually found a few hours later on the QE2 bridge. So that's the bridge which crosses the River Thames in Dartford, some 17 or so miles away. Now, a gun was found inside the vehicle. This is what we've been told by police. And they've also stressed that they aren't looking for anyone else in connection with the shooting. And at the minute, police are under the impression that the man in the vehicle, their suspect, who they think knew Lisa, has gone into the water, and they are still 3 days on looking for him. They haven't yet told us how the pair were connected, but obviously that's a crucial part of their investigation as they continue to search for this individual while saying they're not looking for anybody else. But the detail there of Lisa Smith, 43 years old, having lost her life. As I said, she was from Slough. That picture of her we've seen today, the name, that is really the most crucial piece of information, as obviously Kent Police continue to try to work, gathering forensic evidence, speaking to witnesses, trying to work out what happened on Friday night.
Rachel, thank you. Still to come here on the UK Tonight, as a British couple is detained in Iran. I'll be talking to the daughter of a British Iranian man, Anousheh Ashouri, who spent nearly 5 years in prison in Iran. Welcome back. We're just going to show you some more live pictures from Toronto's Pearson Airport, where, as you can see, a passenger jet has effectively flipped upside down, crashing there. It was flying from Minneapolis, a jet that carries normally more than 70 people. Remarkably, 8 people have been injured, 1 person critical, and it appears the rest of the people on board, we don't know exactly how many as yet, have all been accounted for. So no one has died, but 1 person has been critically injured and 7 others injured as well in that plane crash with that Delta passenger jet that flew from Minneapolis to Toronto's Pearson Airport, seeming to flip upside down somehow on the runway there. It's very snowy conditions. We don't want to presume what happened to the plane, but as you can see, emergency services are on there. They've been dousing the plane just to make sure that there are no flames, that it doesn't burst into flames or catch fire, obviously. But so far, it seems that everybody has been accounted for. 1 person is critically injured and 7 others have been hurt as well. We'll bring you more on that as it develops throughout the evening here on Sky News. But now let's return to UK news and the family of a British couple detained in Iran. So they are deeply focused on ensuring their safe return. Craig and Lindsay Foreman were arrested last month while they were on a motorbiking trip across the globe heading to Australia. The state-run media in Iran says they're being held now on unspecified security charges. Joining me to talk about this is Alika Ashuri, the daughter of British-Iranian man Anousheh Ashuri, who spent nearly 5 years in prison in Iran. Alika, thanks for taking the time. When you first heard about what happened to the Foremans, what was your reaction?
Obviously, it's a really shocking and sad news, but unfortunately, these are news that are inevitable coming from Iran because we've seen it happen over and over again. For as long as people continue to travel to Iran, there is always the risk of them being taken, as we've seen with my dad's case and with Nazanin Ratcliffe's case, and a lot more, not just from the UK, but across the globe.
Yes, and obviously it took a lot of campaigning from Nazanin's family, from your family as well, to free them both. We'll come back to that in a second. We'll come back to the kind of things your dad experienced. But reading about this couple, they seem to be having a whale of a time. They've been talking about the kindness of strangers, people being, the same the world over in terms of inviting people in, sharing food, breaking bread, that kind of thing. Is it important here to separate Iranian people from the Iranian government?
Absolutely, and I have always made sure to refer to the people of Iran as, Iran and Iranian people. And when I talk about the regime, I refer to them as the Islamic regime because they are completely separate. And before this thing happened to my dad, I was also naively a big advocate of going to Iran and visiting Iran, and I did frequently, even knowing the risks. I mean, at the time, the risks weren't that obvious to me. I was in my 20s and I didn't know of many other cases. But as the years have progressed, we've seen more and more cases happening, and Iran, the Islamic regime, has been using the Iranian people and people with dual and foreign nationalities to get what they want politically. And no matter how beautiful Iran is, and it's a beautiful country, very culturally rich and amazing landscapes to visit. But with the current regime, even the people inside Iran are hostages to this regime, let alone people who want to visit.
Your dad, as you said there, has dual nationality, but he was accused of spying for Israel, a country he'd never even been to. It took 5 years for him to then eventually come out. What was his experience like from the off when he was detained and then held in prison?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's such a bogus charge. And when you compare the indictments of the people that are detained, when you see them, they are actually word by word the same. So they just have a blueprint of a charge that they would give to various people that they take. And it just shows how hollow these allegations are and how much of just a game it all is. And
yes,
for the families, it's when it happens to you and you're not expecting it, it's obviously shocking, because we were never a political family and neither were the other people who have been taken. So it's what I refer to as the opposite of the lottery. It doesn't happen to everyone, but there is that element of risk. And the Islamic regime has always used this exact anomaly to catch people, because like Craig and Lisa, I think as humans, we have the tendency to see the innate good in people and societies, and we refuse to believe that things happen to people for no reason. And that's exactly what's happening.
Look, I'm sure people will be wondering why they visited there, because the Foreign Office advice is not to do so. Of course, if you're a British national, they've done what they've done. What would you say to the family of Craig and Lindsay right now, as they're obviously hoping and praying that they come back?
I mean, I can just say to them to stay strong and that these things will get resolved, for them to be very publicly available and campaign as much as possible, and not to be scared to be loud.
Alika, really appreciate your time. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Coming up on the UK Tonight, we'll take a look back at Spurs' 1-0 win against fellow Premier League strugglers Manchester United. And we'll show you more of this incredible footage of a humpback whale putting on a real show. Look at that, off the coast of Cornwall.
We're going to do this 100 times every day for the next 3 months.
Why have we agreed to this?
Raises many questions about many things.
Actually seeing people impacted, she was so upset.
It was powerful. They kind of couldn't believe they were being berated here.
Very much on my terms, I think was the subtext. News happens fast around Donald Trump.
It was a kind of wow moment.
Yeah, that's what it feels like, doesn't it?
It's Trump world, and we just live in it.
So, where next?
Follow Trump 100 wherever you get your podcasts.
Prime Minister Modi is the most popular politician in the country. He is expected to win his 3rd term in these elections.
Jubilation in the streets, while some emotional.
This is a political victory for Prime Minister Modi and his Hindu Nationalist Party, a promise fulfilled. I'm Neville Lazarus, and I'm Sky's reporter based in Delhi.
He paid over $50,000 to traffickers to get him to America. Instead, he was kidnapped, tied up, and threatened by smugglers. A commando from the state force walks me through to a Maitai village on the front line.
Firing the civilian and they're burning our house.
We cross to the opposite side, held by the cookies.
When they fire, we have to retaliate.
Sky News, get the full story first. Companies like these are helping India in its trajectory to be a serious player in space exploration.
The enthusiasm is palpable. The young desire change.
These elections are a pivotal moment for the country's economic and political history. The concern here is that the public healthcare system is inadequate.
In a prayer, she's asking God to help understand what happened. I cannot carry on. God, help me. He says his world has crashed. Like him, there are scores of families searching for their loved ones.
Too often have families endured such tragedies for the negligence not only by the administration, but also by spiritual people in this country. Free, wherever you get your news. Even though it has few seats in Parliament, Kashmir is symbolic and very significant. It's often been called a nuclear flashpoint.
Welcome back. Coming up, incredible footage of a humpback whale just off the coast of Cornwall, breaching. It's amazing. Don't miss it. But first, also amazing, Dave Fulton is here with the sport. Talking of big whales of the Premier League era, Spurs and United, but It's incredible how they're both really struggling in the bottom half, isn't it?
Yeah, this was being billed as the desperation derby, which I think was a bit harsh. Obviously, Spurs won it 1-0. In terms of where it leaves both managers, I mean, in league terms, it leaves Man United 15th. Not that far off the drop zone. That's kind of unthinkable. But they've got a record that compares with the 73-74 season when they were relegated. Spurs are out the Carabao Cup, where they lost to Liverpool. They're out the FA Cup, but they have had back-to-back victories in the league. But Ruben Amorim perhaps wishing he was still in Lisbon, where Sporting had won 11 from 11. All was rosy in his world.
Yeah.
And, it's been tough going for him.
But Ange has been under pressure at Spurs, but he got a few of his injured players back, and Maddison seemed to be the difference yesterday. When it comes to Ruben Amorim, I can't think of any other manager who's come in and had a worse start at this at a club the size of United.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think he's lost 8 of his 14 league games. They've gone quite well in the Europa League. Obviously, Erik ten Hag did some of that. And he's trying to implement this new system, this kind of 3-4-3 system. His players aren't really suited to that. He's wedded to that. Ange Postecoglou perhaps wedded to a high line and a kind of gung-ho approach. Well, Ruben Amorim is kind of wedded to his style as well. He needs a bit of time and a bit of patience, I think, from the board. He's Ineos's first kind of permanent signing. So I think he'll get that time. But you know what football's like, Matt? It's a results business, and he needs to start to turning it round. And he's had lots of injuries as well. His best player since he's been there, Amad Diallo, is out for the rest of the season. So it's tough, and he hasn't helped himself in some regards. He said it may be perhaps the worst team in the history of Manchester United. He's saying his job is so hard. You know, these are kind of first world problems in a way. But you know, we wish him well. He's quite charismatic, and he's good telly, isn't he? So
he is.
yeah, that's Manchester United, and that is Tottenham as well. Got a little bit of Arsenal coming up in a minute.
Staying connected is vital for business. Sky Business sponsors this report.
Meanwhile, clubs themselves are also conscious of how important relationships with parents are.
Hopefully today sets the scene a little bit. First task, guys, just to see where your thinking is if you scan that QR code.
Used to be years ago, you had this vision of players standing outside a room and coming in to see the head teacher and being told you can keep or not. That's gone. We have 4 formal catch-ups with the parents throughout the year. Our doors are always open to the parents to come and speak to us at any point. There's so much online information they access. The key bit for us is managing that narrative as they go on the journey. So educating parents as well, because the pressure that often comes for people to be footballers doesn't come from the football clubs. That message has changed. What we want to say is, right, come to our club, we'll look after you from nutrition, we'll look after you from a medical perspective, we'll look after you from a football perspective. You'll train in great facilities with wonderful coaches. You go and enjoy the journey, you'll do multi-sports. Quite a different experience from many people anticipate academies actually are. But what we also need to do is make sure that mum and dad, when they go in the car after the game, aren't just focusing on becoming a Premier League footballer, because we accept that they're not all going to be that.
Sky Business sponsors this report.
Thanks very much indeed, Dave. Now, my next guest tonight had a whale of a time at the end of... I didn't write that. At the end of last week, when he went out and shot some incredible footage off the coast of Cornwall. Have a look. Ian Boreham filmed a humpback whale breaching several times just off the coast of Newquay, with the animal putting on a show for more than half an hour. The whale has apparently been repeatedly visiting the Cornish shores since New Year's Eve, and I'm really glad to say that Ian joins me now. Ian, remarkable footage. Just describe the moment when you first saw the whale breaching and then doing this for half an hour.
Well, it was actually breathtaking, to be honest. We were on the boat. The boat had just been taking part in a seal survey, a wildlife survey along the coast of Cornwall with the Cornwall Seal Group. And just after, we went out in the bay again and looked around for about 5-10 minutes around the coastline. We knew it'd been there since January on most days along that coast. And suddenly, it just breached right in front of us. And it was absolutely stunning to see this huge whale just virtually lift right out the water. And it was quite spectacular, to be honest.
You've described it as the experience of a lifetime, haven't you?
Yes, it's not the sort of thing you get round in Cornwall. We've had humpbacks since, well, about 2014, on and off. And over the last few years, they've increased in number. But this is the first time some have stayed around Newquay for since New Year's Eve. And to see them breach, for a length of time is incredible. As you can see there, the sea isn't exactly calm, and it's rather windy as well.
Was the whale definitely on its own? Because they're quite social creatures, aren't they? And I was looking into why whales breach, and there is an element of socialising about it, as far as I understand. I mean, what do I know? But this is just a bit of Googling. But it does beg the question, was the whale just on its own doing this?
As far as I gather, there were 2 whales in the bay around Newquay at the time. We've only seen one mainly, but every now and then you see, I gather people are being seen 2 at the same time. Last week, apparently there were 4, 2 in Newquay Bay, and the other 2 were over towards St Agnes, which is about 8-9 miles away from here. And they were all seen at about the same time. So perhaps that socialisation thing is part of why they've been breaching, trying to communicate.
Maybe. And you know what? Every time we see these pictures, we're just thinking, wow, it's just an incredible thing. I've seen basking sharks off Cornwall, and they're pretty impressive because they're huge, although they're not particularly dangerous, luckily. But to see a whale is just phenomenal. If you had
that pectoral fin, sorry.
Yes. No, go on, Ian, go on.
That pectoral fin is about almost a third of the length of the body. And we reckon that's a good 3 to 4 meters long. You can see the pectoral fin flapping there.
Yes, we can see it. Look, Ian, it's phenomenal. We're so glad you managed to capture the shots that we're seeing now, and so glad you could come to talk to us about it as well. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, let's take a quick look at the weather to finish off. Good for Wales because it's staying cold tomorrow before turning, well, maybe a bit milder as well on Wednesday. There'll be a windy evening, but Britain looks essentially dry bar a few wintry showers. In the northeast, Ireland and Northern Ireland can expect rain. That will spread across Northern Ireland and into Scotland overnight, turning light and patchy away from the western coast. There'll be some snow in places, especially the hills, and a small risk of freezing rain. That's all from us. The World Next is with Yalda, who I'm sure will have much more on that plane crash at Toronto's Pearson Airport. I'm back tomorrow at 8. Bye for now.